Well, good afternoon and welcome to this public lecture given at the Society of Antiquaries. I'm Rowie Sweet, I'm one of the vice presidents, and I'm delighted to welcome you, particularly if this is the first time you've been here, and particularly if you've had to struggle like I have with cancelled trains and horribly overcrowded carriages. And before we begin, I'd just like briefly to tell you a little bit about the Society. We were founded in 1707 for the second time, really. It was an Elizabethan Society of Antiquaries as well, but that fizzled out because James I disapproved of its sort of slightly political activities. But so founded again in 1707 and started out simply as a meeting of like-minded people in a pub, of course, the Bear Tavern on the Strand. And gradually it became more formalised. And by 1751, it sought and acquired a charter of incorporation, which gave it a kind of institutional identity and critically meant that it could actually own property and people could leave it to bequests. And by 1780, it had become sufficiently important and recognised that George III decided to give the Society rooms in Somerset House alongside the Royal Society. So if you go to Somerset House now, you can still see the heading over the entrances to the Antiquaries and to the Royal Society. And this gave a fixed base for the first time, rather than travelling around different taverns and meeting place coffee houses, and really meant that the Society could start building up its library and its museum and hold regular meetings. We moved into these premises in Burlington House in 1874 and have been here ever since. And if you haven't yet had a chance to look at the library, do find the time to do so at some point. It is an extraordinary example of a specialist, purpose-built, top-lit research library. It's absolutely beautiful. And the Society has always been established in order to focus on research relating to the study of primarily British antiquities, recording them, preserving them. And these remain our core objectives. I think in this century, we've also been much more focused on the communication and dissemination of knowledge about our collections and about the research that our fellows undertake. We hold regular exhibitions as well as these public lectures and research seminars, workshops, etc., to try and promote research into anything relating to the material past. And last year, we launched our affiliate membership scheme. So if you're here and you're not already an affiliate, do ask about how you become an affiliate member. So today's lecture is on Dickens, Antiquity and Literary Tourism by Dr. Lee Jackson. Lee Jackson is a well-known expert on Victorian London. He's published numerous books, many with Yale University Press, including Dirty Old London in 2014, Palaces of Pleasure in 2019, and Dickens Land, The Curious History of Dickens's London, which has come out this year in 2023. He maintains the website of primary sources, victorianlondon.org, and he regularly lectures on Victorian topics for libraries and museums throughout London and is an academic advisor to the Dickens Museum.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great honour to be here in this beautiful building. This is basically a talk in two halves. I'm going to start talking about Dickens and antiquity and then move on to Dickensian literary tourism. And these two subjects, I think, are intimately interrelated, and hopefully that relationship will become a little clearer by the end of this lecture. It hardly needs stating that old buildings feature prominently in Dickens's novels. Walter Bagehot's much quoted comment that Dickens described London like a special correspondent posterity is preceded by Bagehot remarking on Dickens's unique ability to recall diverse old buildings and curious people. Dickens gives us something of an explanation for their appeal in the Pickwick Papers. describing the old coaching inns of the borough, he says, "Great rambling queer old places they are, with galleries and passages and staircases wide enough and antiquated enough to furnish materials for 100 ghost stories." So he makes the link there between the sort of materiality of the old inns of Borough High Street and the associated stories and legends that go with them. Their tangible, aged features, the ancient galleries, the labyrinthine passages and staircases are almost the solid foundations on which these stories rest. They're kind of a scaffold and stimulus for storytelling, the imagination. He goes a little further, actually, in Master Humphrey's clock, which was the precursor to the old curiosity shop, where old Master Humphrey conjures up ghosts in his old house. He imagines spectral, historic presences inhabiting the rooms and explains to the reader why this happens. For who can wonder that man should feel a vague belief in tales of disembodied spirits wandering through these places, when he himself, scarcely less separated from his old world than they, is forever lingering upon past emotions in bygone times, and hovering the ghost of his former self about the places and people that warmed his heart of old. I haunt the house where I was born. So in other words, we conjure up the historic past because we live with our own remembered and reimagined past, our memories, associated with long vanished people and localized to place. And there's a double meaning in that last sentence, the house where I was born, of course. It's also a metaphor for the mind. And this is all very much borrowing from Samuel Rogers' 1792 poem, The Pleasures of Memory, where the narrator finds his house's ancient furniture and furnishings, quote, whisper of the past, i.e. both conjure up a sort of imagined antiquity and scenes from personal memory. There's also a sense here that the process of memory, reimagining one's own past, provides a mental model for how we conjure up the historical past, and that equally the historical imagination returns us to personal memories. Humphrey also becomes, as he puts it, the ghost of his former self, where the past somehow seems more real to him than the present. And this is surely Dickens meditating not only on acts of sort of historical imagination, and memory, but also on fiction, which likewise conjures up its own disembodied figures, which somehow seem substantial enough to make the reader feel like a ghostly looker-on. So I suggest that Dickens sees very close parallels between historical imagination, personal memory, and storytelling. But he also gives us a further explanation for why we summon up scenes from the past at ancient sites, beyond their intimate association with memory. He links the sort of imaginative potency of ancient places to what he calls their mystery, a word which often appears when Dickens is discussing antiquity. For example, he writes in an uncommercial traveller piece, one of his pieces of non-fiction, of an expedition he was making to City of London churches every weekend. He's visiting as many churches as he can in the City of London, basically, one a week. And he says, though, no answer to any antiquarian question on the subject that I put to books shall harass the reader's soul. He won't trouble his readers with antiquaries. A full half of my pleasure in them arose out of their mystery. Mysterious I found them, mysterious they shall remain to me. Now, of course, there could be no more antiquarian activity in the tour of City of London churches, but he focuses instead on the imaginative potential, their ill-assorted tiny congregations, the atmosphere, literal and metaphorical, of decay, his own memories of being dragged to church, and even a teenage romantic tryst sheltering in a church from the rain. This ancient place stimulates imagination, memory, and narrative. Pip's brief fantasy about restoring the ruined Satis house in Great Expectations likewise shows another link between antiquity and mystery. Pip says, I had stopped to look at the house as I passed, and its seared red brick walls, locked windows, and strong green ivy, clasping even the stacks of chimneys with its twigs and tendons, as if its sinewy old arms had made up a rich, attractive mystery of which I was the hero. So the ruined house makes up a mystery, blurring the possible meanings of comprise and invent. It's almost as if this physical place, its antiquity, its ruins, generate this romantic story, which Pitt tells himself of restoring the building and winning Estella, in the same way as noted above, the old inns of the borough furnish materials for stories and legends. And this is, in essence, I think, the power of the ruin or the fragment to suggest something missing, a larger whole about which we inevitably sort of speculate, while simultaneously bringing ourselves to that as well, our memories, our prejudices, our expectations. To quote John Forsyth, author of Remarks on Antiquities in 1802, "We must fancy what a ruin has been. We rebuild and repeople it. We call in history. We compose, we animate, we create." Dickens then, I think, sees this link between memory, imagination, and narrative. And we can also see it explored by his own characters. Pip, for example, has a glimpse of an aristocratic old London when he conveys Estella to a society hostess in Richmond in Great Expectations, and finds that she'll be staying in, quote, "a house by the green, staid old house where hoops and powder and patches, embroidered coats, rolled stockings, ruffles and swords had their court days many a time." And Pip then envisions the house's former visitors. He writes of a bell with an old voice, which I dare say in its time had often said to the house, "Here is the green farthingale, here is the diamond-hilted sword, here are the shoes with red heels and the blue solitaire." The bell sounded gravely in the moonlight. So the past is sort of imagined in situ here, and the people from the past are described in terms of their period clothing, very much in the style of a historical novel, because it's all Pip's thoughts. And Dickens explores how a chain of mental associations leads Pip from the building via a sort of cliched imagining of old London to a nonetheless very personal and revealing fantasy. It's a vision of the past rooted in antique place, but shaped and coloured by historical fiction and Pip's own very romantic daydreams. It's an echo of that moment outside Satie's house where he imagined he could marry Estella and restore the ruined property as if in a romance. In short, to do all the shining deeds of the young knight of romance and marry the princess. So again, we're seeing that blend of memory, imagination, narrative, all focused on the old building. And I think this is what Dickens believes old buildings do for us. It's an active property of antiquity. Pip, of course, also takes comfort in the imagined past at the very start of Great Expectations. In the famous opening chapter, he conjures up images of his own parents on the tombstone in the churchyard. Young Pip, who cannot yet read, obtains, quote, my first fancies regarding what they were like from the shape of the very letters on the stones, drawing idiosyncratic conclusions from the text, which is treated not as an inscription, but an antiquarian object whose very contours prompt imaginative visions of the past. The shape of the letters on my father's grave gave me an odd idea that he was a square, stout, dark man with curly black hair. Now, setting children to deciphering tombstones was a common way of encouraging reading and literary skill in the early 19th century. Young Pip, unfortunately, neither succeeds in deciphering the letters in the intended fashion or acquiring any edifying religious sentiment from the seemingly clear-cut memorial. There could hardly be an antiquarian object with a clearer message for posterity than a tombstone, but Dickens makes clear that we bring our own preoccupations and imaginations to bear instead. Pip creates not merely his fancies, but memories of his parents from this tombstone, or these fancies which serve as substitutes for memories that he never possessed. And these in turn become how he remembers his parents, forever associated with that material object. So the tombstone is almost like a focal point, where history and memory, public, personal, fact, and fiction collide and combine. And Dickens, I would argue, sees this potential not just in the memorial of the tombstone, but in most or many ancient sites and objects. Perhaps the most striking incident of sort of historical imagination in Dickens is a passage in the old curiosity shop where little Nell sees the evil quilt at the medieval gateway of a county town. The ancient building again prompts Nell to reflect on past scenes. What strange people it must have looked down upon. How many hard struggles might have taken place and how many murders might have been done upon that silent spot. So Nell's historical imaginings are tinged by Gothic fiction. She leaps to sensational ideas of murder associated with this gloomy location, but she's also thinking of her own history of hard struggles. Simultaneously, Nell almost seems to magically conjure up Quill, who abruptly appears on the scene, the embodiment of both the brutal antiquity of her imagination and her own fears, as if he were a creature born of the imagination, fiction in himself. Quill is physically present, but is said to have risen out of the earth like some fairy tale goblin or undead monster, or an ancient relic that's been exhumed. For Nell, seeing the ancient arch prompts this chain of associations, again, from imagining the past in situ, dwelling on her own past, which summons Quill into her presence. And simultaneously, we have this memory, this ghost, this disinterred relic. History, memory, fantasy all seem to swirl around the nexus of this ancient arch. So if Dickens sees this great imaginative potential in ancient place, why does he often mock historical imaginings? We have, for example, Mrs. Skewton's rapturous, romanticized appreciation of Warwick Castle in Dombey and Son. Those darling bygone times with their delicious fortresses and their dear old dungeons. Ignoring the reality, of course, brutality and torture is Dickens' point. Or famously, Pickwick's cited discovery of a Roman inscription, which turns out to be the signature of an idle contemporary labourer. There are also Dickens's comical musings on the mysterious inscription above the doorway in Staple Inn near Windrude, which bears the initials PJT. You can see them there today. And Dickens comes up with names for it. Perhaps John Thomas, perhaps John Tyler. Pretty jolly too, possibly jabbered thus. In Martin Chuzzlewit, there's also a long-winded explanation of the Chuzzlewit family's dubious claim to connection with Guy Fawkes, which involves, quote, a dark lantern of undoubted antiquity. Heavy sarcasm on undoubted, which Dickens makes clear is totally invented, and as far as he is concerned, only connects the Chuzzlewit family to a wretched, primitive period of British history. So in short, Dickens seems very skeptical about those who daydream about the past. We see this again in Barnaby Rudge, where the landlord of the quaint, ancient Maypole Inn insists on telling everyone the local legend that Queen Elizabeth used the mounting block outside the pub and mounting her horse had an altercation with a neglectful page boy. Dickens notes that many people are doubtful about this tale, but all the landlord has to do is point at the mounting block as evidence, as if the object's very existence proves the story, and all objections are crushed. And again, Dickens seems to be mocking here those who fetishize historic objects, and yet he himself in the same chapter waxes lyrical about the historic features of the Maypole Inn. Give you an idea, an old building with more gable ends than a lazy man would care to count on a sunny day, huge zigzag chimneys, overhanging stories, drowsy little panes of glass, and front bulging out and projecting over the pathway. The old house looked as if it was nodding in its sleep. Ivy, like a warm garment, comforted in its age, wrapped its green leaves closely around the time-worn walls. So why does Dickens mock antiquarianism when he himself has this great investment in old buildings and their imaginative potential? I think it's because he is a very, very self-aware author. Partly it's self-referential humour, a sort of in-joke for a certain class of reader. He mocks the landlord in Barnaby Rudge, even as he himself evokes what seems a very nostalgic vision of the past. But I think he's also covering himself, anticipating his critics. He's very aware also of how historical novelists of the period were mocked for their fetishistic interest in historical detail, the lengthy descriptions of objects, clothing, old buildings, and so on. It's a knowing wink to the reader also to say, yes, I know I'm sketching these picturesque scenes of antiquity, but I'm doing it for a purpose. Dickens always wants people to think he has a purpose and a moral purpose. And indeed, within Barnaby Rudge, the Maple Inn comes to represent an overly cosy, backwards-looking, nostalgic vision of old England. Conservatism and nostalgia is a form of national malaise. And Dickens was very wary about being seen as a purveyor of picturesque scenes. There's a passage in his travelogue Pictures from Italy, for example, when he calls for a new picturesque. And in that passage, he's talking about bringing out the reality of poverty behind the quaint, dilapidated buildings of old Italy, a moral deployment of the picturesque, if you will. And I think he applies that to the past as well. He wants a moral interest in the past. And similarly, when editing the work of Edward Bulwer Lytton for All the Year Round, he would advise his fellow writer that scenic appliances should be subdued to the piece instead of the piece being sacrificed to them. It's a put down, I think, slightly forward. So what therefore would Dickens have made of the Dickens tourism industry that sprung up after his death, which is, of course, was very much obsessed with the scenery of his fiction? So let's talk a little bit about Dickens tourism. It was something of a phenomenon in the late 19th century. From the 1880s onwards, a vast amount of printed material was produced. Newspaper stories, magazine articles, books, guidebooks, travelogues, you name it. Checking if I have a slide here. Oh yes, so here's some of the purveyors of Dickensian literary tourism. There were literary acolytes like Percy Fitzgerald, who was a young author in the 1850s, who Dickens sort of brought on in Household Words and All the Year Round. He wrote quite a few pieces of sort of exploring Dickens' London. There were journalists of various sorts. First serial set of articles produced by John R.G. Hazard, the literary editor of the New York Tribune in 1879. There were professional tour guides. A gentleman called Robert Albert wrote a book called London Rambles on Zigzag with Charles Dickens in 1886, and he was a tour guide and giving Dickens tours at the time. There was what the newspapers called the Dickens cult, which is not quite as sinister as it sounds. They just meant fans. And we have here, for instance, on the left, William R. Hughes, who was one of the great first collectors of Dickens' first editions and memorabilia, and also, in fact, the treasurer of the city of Birmingham. And we have also there on the left, Frederick Kitten, an illustrator, wrote several books on Dickens and Dickensiana. And I have to include Joseph Ashby Sterry, if only for his amazing moustache, who was a journalist, I think quite wealthy. He had a very nice flat overlooking Trafalgar Square. And he wrote lots of things to do with Dickens' London, some very amateurish poetry about it as well. He was a contributor to Punch. And he was credited on his demise with inventing the term Dickensian as opposed to the term Dickensonian. So we could have gone that way. But there was more to Dickens tourism than printed guides and travelogues. There were actual tours, of course, as I sort of hinted at. An interesting one is the Lady Guides Association, founded by Edith Davis in the late 1880s. She had on her books, quote, intelligent gentlewomen who were acquainted with every single place of which mention is made in the great novelist's work. She also did tours of Jack the Ripper's London as early as 1890, make of that what you will. There were public speakers doing magic lantern shows. So we have here Frank Oakes Rose, who was on stage in New York in the 1880s. Magic lantern shows, of course, toured the country in the UK, village halls, town halls, and Dickens' London was a very popular set of slides. The film producer Cecil Hepworth, who produced many Dickens films in the 1910s and 1920s, had a father who toured with a magic lantern slide, and one of the sets he most commonly remembered was called The Footprints of Charles Dickens. And there were indeed films. There was a film called Leaves from the Book of Charles Dickens in 1912, which showed you key sites in Dickens' London. Another one made in 1924, simply called Dickens' London, which you can find on BFI Player if you're so inclined. And lots of visual media, ephemera. Dickens' London was a big thing. So here we have cigarette cards on the slides, which were, I think, from the 1920s. Posters, paintings, you name it. So there was a real fascination with Dickens tourism, which starts after Dickens' death. What sort of places were tourists interested in? Well, I would divide it into two types of locations, essentially. Ones that look particularly visually interesting or quaint, redolent of the past, and ones that had a particular importance or charge within the sort of imaginative charge within the original novels. And of course, places that tick both boxes were ideal. Coaching inns, of course, were a particular object of interest. Dickens was in some ways seen as the poet laureate of the coaching inn, following the publication of the Pickwick Papers, that first great picaresque novel in which the characters travelled the country by stagecoach, roaming from one inn to another. And the inns themselves, those that survived into the second half of the 19th century, were visually distinctive, quaint old places, part of a vanishing old England. So what better place for literary tourists to seek out? The only problem was that even from the mid-19th century, such places were very much under threat. The first railway line in London, from Deptford to Spa Road in Bermondsey, opened a month before the first episode of the Pickwick Papers came out. London Bridge in Euston opened during the run of the serialisation. And of course, in the decades that followed, coaching inns began to close down one by one. Some would be recycled by road hauliers as railway freight depots. Many were demolished. Now, Dickens, of course, saw this coming. He writes in the novel specifically about the evocative, quaint atmosphere of Southwark's old inns. He says, in the borough especially, there still remains some half dozen old inns which have preserved their external features unchanged and which have escaped alike the rage for public improvement and the encroachments of private speculation. Great rambling queer old places they are, with galleries and passages and staircases and so on. He sounds even a little nostalgic here. Even in 1837, he sees this threat of public improvement and the encroachments of private speculation. Doesn't that ring a bell, even in London today? And no surprise there, but once the tourism boom begins after his death, these places that had a nostalgic appeal to Dickens himself really appeal to literary pilgrims. The obvious place for them to look, of course, is perhaps the first and most famous inn in Dickens, the White Hart Inn in Southwark. It's the place where Pickwick meets the precocious boots or boot cleaner, Sam Weller, who becomes his trusted friend and servant, and many people thought the great sort of breakout character in the book. He would prove very popular. Sam Weller was credited with even saving the book. Circulation sprang up once he was in it. Dickens described this meeting in the White Hart. He describes the inn itself, a double tier of bedroom galleries with old clumsy balustrades round two sides of the straggling area, and a double row of bells to correspond, sheltered from the weather by a little sloping roof hung over the door leading to the bar and coffee room. 2 or 3 gigs and chaise carts were wheeled up under different little sheds and penthouses, and the occasional heavy tread of a cart horse or rattling of a chain at the farther end of the yard announced to anybody who cared about the matter that the stable lay in that direction. It's a great description. Of course, it's accompanied by this famous illustration as well by Fizz. And so we have, is it by Fizz? No, yes, it is by Fizz. Thank God, I thought I had that horribly wrong. And it's a great description. Dickens singles this place out, and of course, tourists. Alfred Rimmer, author of About England with Dickens, written in 1883, visits. He finds the remains of the inn satisfying enough at start. It has red Dutch tiles and a sloping roof. The inn's common room for guests still retains ancient features, a fireplace several centuries old, and a groin department that certainly dates back to the time when Canterbury pilgrims used to rest here. Which may be slightly surprising as the inn had burned down in 1676, but you never know. Part had been converted into a restaurant, but he's okay with that because it includes decent food, steak and chops of the very best, and a dinner of half a grouse with bread sauce for 18 pence. Bargain. But as this description of visiting the White Hart Inn goes on, Mr. Rimmer becomes ever more morose. He regretfully informs his readers that the rest of the ground floor has been occupied by a curer of bacon. He notes that the galleries and rooms have been converted into shoddy flats for the poor. The stables are in ruins. The yard is filled with rubbish, and so on and so forth. This is a picture of the White Hart from the 1880s, when the time he visited. The place seems clearly in decline, its days numbered. Percy Fitzgerald, the writer I referred to earlier, he visits the following year, a very similar picture. Bacon dryers shed, washing lines across the yard, squalid women hanging about the galleries. Oh my gosh. And overall, the place is black, grimed, rusty, and decayed, a rather Dickensian line in itself. And it's fascinating because both these accounts of the White Hart are plainly tinged with melancholy and disappointment. The grim spectacle of this decaying inn seems a long way from the jolly world of Pickwick. It's a Dickensian experience, but not the one they were hoping. And by 1889, in fact, the inn would be demolished. It made way for a hops store in Southwark, obviously. Southwark very associated with hops and brewing. So how did Dickensian tourists cope with this disappointment? Well, they went a few yards down the road to the George Inn. The George was another coaching inn, again destroyed in 1676 by the Great Fire of Southwark, but rebuilt along its original lines. It was affected too by the coming of the railways. Sold to St. Thomas's Hospital in 1849, who demolished the stables at the rear. And the remaining section was sold to the Great Northern Railway in 1874, who used it as a goods depot. But one side of this yard remained as a gallery tavern. So Mr. Rimmer pops in after visiting the White Hart and finds it scrupulously clean and whitewashed. Fitzgerald likewise appreciates its bright and bustling air of business. If one was looking for a Pickwickian atmosphere in the borough, in other words, this seemed a little more like it. And by the 1890s, it was essentially the last inn standing, the last surviving coaching inn in the borough. And it becomes, of course, a Dickensian destination. The only problem was that it had very little to do with Dickens. There's a single sentence in Little Dorrit where the possibility of someone having got into George to write a letter is mentioned, half a sentence. That's about it. Nonetheless, Dickens tourists flocked there. Here we have some American tourists from around about 1900. Joseph Ashby Story, that mustachio journalist I mentioned earlier, he actually claimed in one article that Dickens had this pub in mind when he was writing about the White Hart, but merely changed the names. But regardless, the pub's manager, a certain Amelia Dyer, who took over in about 1868 and ran it till 1903, and then followed by her daughter, Agnes, through to 1934. Both the Dyers actually played up this Dickensian connection, no end. Geraniums, Dickens's favourite flower, were lining the balconies. Agnes, in the early years of the 20th century, showed tourists the very room where characters from the Pickwick Papers had met, as if they'd actually been real people. She had a sitting room filled with old photographs, pictures and ornaments, pewter, the post boy's pistol and trade bills, and she would happily show those to visitors. And Dickens, she informed them with a straight face, had a favourite table and was a regular visitor and sat in the corner. And of course, Dickens then begins to feature in advertising. Here's an advert from the 1920s. Dickens knew the worth of real comfort and good fare. Try them yourself at a Dickens Inn. Good bedrooms, excellent cooking, and English meat. Retired, quaint, old-fashioned, yet close to modern business needs. In the 1920s, Agnes also encouraged the Tabard Players, who were a local theatre group, put on an annual Dickens play in the inn yard every year. And obviously, this is the old medieval fashion of putting on plays in an inn yard. And here we have the Tabard Players, I think, performing Oliver Twist. And of course, this was also very good every year for publicising the inn itself. So did Dickens have any connection? No, not really that we know of. The present owner, the National Trust, has always rather fudged the issue with phrases like Dickens knew the hospitality of the inn, knew it personally, knew of it, we don't know. I don't think this necessarily matters. You wouldn't call it a fraud, but there is a degree of wishful thinking there. Tourists are generally happy with it being Dickensian, I think, even in this broader sense, redolent of the Pickwick Papers, redolent of a lost era, redolent of antiquity. And you'll find it mentioned in any Dickens guidebook. Of course, the wishful thinking can go up a notch. I'm going to talk a little now about the so-called Old Curiosity Shop on Portsmouth Street near Lincoln's Inn Fields. We have a particularly eerie glimpse of it here in the background, courtesy of the Dickens Museum. Dickens describes the Old Curiosity Shop in the novel of that name. One of those receptacles for old and curious things which seem to crouch in odd corners of this town and hide their musty treasures from the public eye in jealousy and distrust. There were suits of mail standing like ghosts in armour here and there, fantastic carvings brought from monkish cloisters, rusty weapons of various kinds, distorted figures in china and wood and iron and ivory, tapestry and strange furniture that might have been designed in dreams. That's an amazing description. But of course, he concludes the novel by saying that the shop in question has been demolished, that the street has been redeveloped out of existence, as if almost to put up a sign saying, do not look for the place. I wasn't thinking of a particular shop. In fact, the only clue to the shop's exterior in the book, if it was based on an original, which is not impossible, Dickens based many things on original buildings in London, is this drawing by Phiz, which shows a decaying old townhouse with a very quaint, maybe Jacobean porch. It's a far cry from that Portsmouth Street shop. It's surprising then, as a sort of squat Tudor building with no resemblance to the book's illustrations, Dickens' description, nor any obvious connection to Dickens, became known as the Old Curiosity Shop. And until the opening of the Dickens Museum in 1925, this was absolutely the most popular Dickensian attraction in London. You can measure it in postcards. Go onto eBay and look for the Old Curiosity Shop, and you'll find dozens upon dozens of different images of the shop. You'll find collectibles from money pots to mustard pots. It was a big deal. It was recreated in the Merry England zone of the 1933 Chicago Century of Progress exhibition, along with the likes of the Tower of London, Stoke Poges Church, a recreation of Shakespeare's Globe. It was on that level, a really familiar national icon. How does this happen? Well, partly, as I've sort of implied already, it was thanks to Dickens' vagueness. Every antique shop in London in the 1870s claimed to be the original of the old curiosity shop. But in this case, a certain Mr. Tessiman, who was the original owner in the 1870s, decides to inscribe the words, the old curiosity shop, in Gothic script on the facade. It was then pictured in a US magazine we can see here on the left in 1881. I think it may have been Harper's, which calls it a fake, which says this is a pardonable, albeit misguided desire on the part of the poverty-stricken neighborhood to lift itself to an easy and inexpensive notoriety. But that picture, that image, means that tourists start to seek it out no matter what. And the next owner, Mr. Poole, adds the following line, immortalized by Charles Dickens. And when it's threatened with demolition in 1883, the press go to town about how this iconic venue is on the cusp of destruction, even though no one had heard of it until about 2 or 3 years earlier. It becomes heritage at risk, and the crowds absolutely flourish. Journalists come and report on the crowds. There's a quote allegedly from someone who lived nearby. They went there to worship, a neighboring shopkeeper said, took off their hats, and when they got through the doorway of the shop and asked questions about Quilp and the grandfather as if they'd been actual persons, the ladies were worse. I've known them get down on their knees and burst out crying about Little Nell. I'm not sure all the tourists were getting down on their knees and bursting out crying about Little Nell, but we'll pass over that. But it became a real sort of core celebrity in the press. People were fascinated. But what was the fascination, really? Just those words? I think in part, it appealed, particularly from visiting tourists from America, it appealed to a wider vision of old England, old London that was developing at the time. This land of quaint antiquity, of castles and suits of armor, of Shakespeare. And of course, this was a Tudor building, so it fitted into a certain ideal of English history. The crooked roof, I think, was particularly appealing. Henry James once suggested that it was England's crooked buildings that had produced such a vigorous imagination in writers like Dickens. And that sounds a little ridiculous, but Dickens himself might have agreed. He wrote of Philadelphia in 1842 on his first visit to America, I would have given the world for a crooked street. The regularity and brand newness of America kind of phased. The curiosity shop, or the so-called curiosity shop, was also sufficiently obscure. It was set back from main roads. You kind of had to know where it was to find it, and that played into the sort of idea of Dickens' London as mysterious and labyrinthine. And it does resemble to some degree Sol Gills's shop in Dombey and Son, the shop of the ship's instrument maker, a similar sort of quaint Tudor building with a projecting timbered upper story. So it looks like it could fit into Dickens' milieu, if not that particular book. Even in the time, it was also strikingly different building from its neighbours. It visually stood out from the Victorian, even late Georgian buildings around it. And it also had this uniquely sort of quaint, compact appearance that rendered it very amenable to reproduction. There were postcards and paintings from the very earliest period, from the 1880s. You could buy wooden blocks with the front painted on it, mustard pots, door knockers, etc. And of course, you have that facade, which is kind of like a title page, The Old Curiosity Shop, immortalized by Charles Dickens. As I say, it gets very famous. It appears in silent film versions of the book. It appears in the 1924 guided tour of Dickens Land on film I mentioned. We have the Tabard Players again. Here they are outside the Old Curiosity Shop in the 1930s. It gets reproduced at that World's Fair as well. Here it is actually in America. This is the Dickens Fellowship at the Exposition of Progress, or the American branch, I imagine. And you can see on the right there some of the other old world attractions that were next to it. The shop's fame undoubtedly diminished in, ran ahead, dear me. The shop's fame undoubtedly diminished in the mid-20th century, as did the vogue for Dickens tourism, although it's obviously still a thing. But it's recently been taken over by the London School of Economics, and it's been refurbished. Some people now think it looks too new. So, to summarize it all, of course, not all Dickensian sites were sort of fakery and the product of rampant enthusiasm, but I think both the George and the Old Curiosity Shop tell us something crucial about what drove the boom in Dickens tourism at the turn of the 20th century. It was bigger, actually, I think, than antiquarian fascination with any particular place. It was about having an experience. It's about finding yourself in Dickens' London, a place you could physically immerse yourself in. It was like a virtual reality experience, illustrating the imaginary world of the books in 3 dimensions. And if the locations were historically accurate, fabulous, lovely for antiquarians, so much the better, but they did not have to be. The visual, imaginative appeal of the place triumphed over mere fact. And it's also significant, I think, that many of the places most popular with Dickens tourists were also illustrated in the original novels. It's that visual appeal. There are other threads we could discuss here if we had time. Dickens' London, I think, was also part of the late Victorian fascination with history and heritage. Think of the founding of the Royal Society of Art's Blue Plaque Scheme in the 1860s, the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings in the 1870s, the Society for Photographing Relics of Old London, this photograph of the White Hart I borrowed earlier. I would even argue that Dickens' own writing played some part in people paying closer antiquarian attention to the old buildings of London, or at least to the humbler ones, the shops and coaching inns. It gave them a new lens to which they could focus on that part of the old city. But overall, I think we have to come back to the power of imagination. As Louisa May Alcott puts it, arguably the first Dickens tourist who toured Dickens London in 1866, I read a short piece about it. I felt as if I got into a novel. That's the appeal at the heart of literary tourism. What would Dickens have made of all this? Well, he himself was a literary tourist. He visited Shakespeare's birthplace on at least 2 occasions, possibly 3, I think. He wrote of Verona in Italy. I had been half afraid to go to Verona, lest it should at all put me out of conceit with Romeo and Juliet. But I was no sooner come into the old marketplace, the misgivings vanished. It was so fanciful, quaint, and picturesque a place, formed by such an extraordinary and rich variety of fantastic buildings, that there could be nothing better at the core of even this romantic town, scene of one of the most romantic and beautiful of stories. And equally, as I've suggested, he embraced these fancies, but mocks them as well. He mocks gormless tourists. He mocks Mrs. Skewton with her dear old dungeons. He mocks a couple in Pictures of Italy called Mr. and Mrs. Davis, part of a tour party. The former is always indiscriminately poking about with his umbrella, tracing inscriptions with its tip, removing the tops of ancient urns as if they were pickles. The latter pays no heed to her surroundings at all. She's more interested in the contents of her handbag. And Dickens actually expands on this dislike of clueless tourists in Little Dorrit. He describes them wandering about Rome with their guidebooks, walking about St. Peter's and the Vatican on somebody else's cork legs, i.e. seeing everything through the approved, received opinions of the guidebook, not paying attention to the place at all. And in fact, Dickens was not a big fan of guidebooks, I think it has to be said. I think this is partly because he did not like to be led. He liked to be in charge. In a letter, he once discussed the historical guidebooks written for the Crystal Palace at Sydenham, whose contents were essentially a kind of a walkthrough of world history, period by period. And he describes those guidebooks in the letter as flatulent botheration, which perhaps gives you some clue. I think you could argue, to conclude, I think you could argue this is all very typical of Dickens, actually mocking tourists, enjoying tourism, satirizing antiquarianism while exploiting the evocative power of antiquity. You know, it was his investment in describing these old inns and cane shops which made them appeal to literary tourists. There is a sense in Dickens that he likes to think 2 things at once and have it both ways. Ultimately, however, when I think it comes to literary tourism, he would have been gratified, yes, that his work was remembered, but as we've discussed, he perhaps not to seen it simply remembered simply as a painter of quaint scenes. He didn't want to be remembered for what he would have called his scenic effects. He wanted the moral purpose of stories not to be lost or downplayed. And so I do now come to my final slide. I think, like Betsy Trotwood, David Copperfield, seeing the tourists and their donkeys trampling on her lawn, he too would have said, venturing out and said he would have ventured out and made vigorous hostile demonstrations with the half-breed. It's what Betsy for Dickens. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lee. That was really entertaining. So nice to be reminded of all the scenes from Dickens, which I haven't read enough of recently. It's a bring back child. It's a teenage reading, isn't it? I'm sure there are lots of questions. So if we've got any online or from the floor, people's own readings of Dickens and memories of literary tourism. The thing that struck me listening to you mentioned it right at the end, that he did go to Shakespeare's birthplace, but exactly the same kind of things happening around Shakespeare, but arguably even earlier, because right at the time that Dickens is writing, they're inventing Hathaway's cottage, some memorabilia around Shakespeare and Stratford. And What other parallels do you think there are between the two?
I mean, I think the thing with Dickens and Shakespeare, he goes to the cottage, the birthplace, in very early on, I think, 1967, something like that. And even he was keeping a diary there. It's one of the very few times he ever kept a diary. It's always pretty. And he's saw the cottage, questioned whether the old woman there knew anything about Shakespeare. And so Dickens was a big Shakespeare. Right? He enjoyed his Shakespeare, knew his Shakespeare. And I think it's that thing with Dickens, he always has to be the one who knows, the one in charge. So he always has this doubt about anyone who's going to tell him something, unless maybe he's paying them. He didn't mind paying tour guides in it to take him round and be the sort of guide in that sense, but he liked to be superior. And of course, in the 1840s, that was the period when there were rumours that I think Barnum was going to come over and dismantle Shakespeare's house and take it over to America. And you get the same rumours about the old curiosity shop at the end of the early 1880s. So yeah, I think that thing about antiquity and preservation, it all starts to happen in the mid-century. Actually, Shakespeare's house is one of those great moments where people suddenly think this could be lost, this could disappear entirely. And you could argue that's one of the turning points, I think, in the mid-century. But there's lots going on there as well.
Yeah. And also, I was maybe thinking of the association with Scots novels, and if you look at early 19th century periods, itineraries, particularly in North England, completely changed. And in Kenilworth, Warwickshire's, that's the literary tourism hotspot in Dixie. Stratford and Kenilworth,
Warwick Castle as well.
And
Dickens sends his characters there, but he mocks them as they do it. Scott arguably is the great figure in this outpouring of what I refer to as sort of historical imagination. That idea that these aren't just like old places for antiquarian fascination. They're a place where you can have this, romantic, real, as in the romanticism, this imaginative game. And Scott's kind of the channel for that. And Dickens plays with that. So there's that famous sketch in Sketches by Boz, Meditations in Monmouth Street, where he goes to the old clothes shops in Seven Dials, and he starts looking at the old clothes, and he starts conjuring up visions of who wore them and what stories lie behind them, until in the end, sort of Disney-like fashion, the clothes themselves parade out of the shops. And that, I think, is partly Dickens reflecting on historical fiction, because clothing was the great thing that Scott and his imitators, lesser imitators, often focused on such obscure detail about medieval clothing, that words which you don't know the meaning of, as long as they're there. And Dickens takes that and applies it to old clothing in an old clothes shop. He says, well, there are stories here too, actually. So he applies that sort of antiquarian imagination to modern London. I think you could see that as the real conduit for so much of his work, actually.
Yes. If you can just wait till the microphone comes to you, and then people online can hear as well.
Okay. It's slightly off tangent, but what do you think Dickens would have thought about Demon Copperhead?
I haven't read that. Have you read it?
I've listened to Serialization on the radio.
I mean, I think actually, I haven't read the book, so I don't want to comment on the book. If I could comment, and tangentially, I think he would have enjoyed it.
Yeah.
From what I've heard of it, because of this. I don't know if you've seen the recent Great Expectations that was on BBC television, which basically, my summary of that is that it jettisoned the original motivations of the characters, wholesale elements of the plot, added lots of plot elements that weren't there, changed everything apart from its Victorianness. It kept the costumes perfectly. It kept the recreations of Victorian buildings perfectly, but everything else was jettisoned. And I think Dickens would have hated that, because what he really cared about, or at least what he tells us he cares about, is the moral message in his stories. So if that book tells a story about people and their lives and has some kind of moral behind it, then he would like that much better than things that do a sort of quaint Victorianness or the brand of Dickens passed on to other things. He didn't want his stories changed and confused, but he understood other people could adapt them.
I've only listened to it, I've not read it, but the moral purpose is definitely still there in the podcast. You probably would have quite enjoyed the translation of the innovations. Yeah. Could just wait for the microphone. Great.
Thank you. I think it's interesting to hear about this sort of tourism that, and not essentially with the the actual locations, as you pointed out, the real locations. But it makes me think of what's happening now with Harry Potter. You know, they're sort of the same things. You go to the shambles and the number of kids that have got wands and sort of in York. And no, I think this kind of thing that people need and probably still need today, the sort of fantasy, the real storytelling that Dickens had, that Rowling had as well. I mean, it's interesting to see this sort of go through history. Yeah,
absolutely. And the Harry Potter one, it's a very, very clear parallel, isn't it? And I mean, recently, I think it's in Bedford, very Covent Garden, it's a narrow alleyway with some Georgian windows. And that's become a Harry Potter destination solely because it looks Harry Potter-ish. It fits into the Harry Potter world. Very much the same with Dickens, you know, places because they look Dickens-ish. But in a way that, you know, you can see this in various ways. And Dickens has this in his books as well. People who believe in literature and laugh at it. So I think you can see it as a tribute, if you like, to how Dickens has managed to create all the adaptations that trailed on since then. I've managed to create this idea of a Dickens London that is bigger than any particular location. It's full of ideas and tropes and particular scenes. And obviously films play into that a lot. And you repeat those, particularly, you know, the cobbled streets, the smoking chimneys and so on. But really, you know, it's all there in Dickens' work as well. So even if the place is not a particular place, I think it's kind of testimony to that overall effect of London which he creates. And he knows he's doing that. He very much knows he's creating this effect of the Dickensian city.
I don't have any more questions. I could get very antiquarian with you, but probably not terribly.
There's
oh,
one.
you have one at the back. Brilliant.
It seems to be the American tourists that both in the 19th century and today still pursue the settings of Dickens. Apart from the shared language, why does Dickens resonate with the US audience materially? I must confess I went to Tong to take a picture of Little Nell's grave in the recent show specifically for US friends.
I mean, it's really interesting that Americans have this, and you know, if you look at the history of Dickens tourism, they definitely have this greater investment in Dickensian place. I think it's partly because for them, it is kind of, it is for all of us, but I think if you're coming from America, it's more of a dream world in the first place, right? So I grew up, people think it's a flippant example. To me, it's very real. In the 1970s, I read Spider-Man like mad. And if you don't know Spider-Man comics, they feature New York in intimate detail, and in particular, the rooftops of New York are all drawn lovingly. And when I went to New York 30 years later, it felt like I was in the place of my imagination. And I think places that grab you in childhood, places that you perhaps don't think you're ever going to see, as well, that distance, I think that gives it a certain extra charge. I think it's both those things.
I think it's a very fitting question on which to end. So thank you very much. That was a terrific lecture, really thought-provoking. As I say, so nice to be reminded of all the Dickens that I need to go back and reread. Well, in some cases, read. I haven't read that sketch by God. Anyway, so next week, I could just remind people there's another lecture on 19th century London again, but a somewhat different angle, the Athenaeum Club, a history with Michael Wheeler. So from the sublime to ridiculous or something like that. Yes, anyway, rather different Dickens as well. So do come, it will be taking place here in our apartments in Piccadilly, but also online. If you'd like to come, please do book through our website. And you'll find there our full events program where you can book to join anything else. And do also sign up for our fortnightly newsletter, Salon, which you can do through the website and which will keep you up to date with everything that's going on in society and in the world of heritage more generally. So thank you very much for coming. And thank you again.